Greetings. I'm so excited to be here. I was scheduled to be the speaker some months ago, but the virus got in the way of me being here. My doctor wouldn't let me come. And I thought this was especially important because 20 years ago, I went into the Aviation Hall of Fame of South Carolina at this gathering. And I thought that was important that I be here again. But I couldn't. So Katie came through and said we could try this, and I'm hoping this will work out okay. In the next 20 minutes or so, I intend to give you my entire 96 years of life and give you enough to entertain you. So the first thing I think really is talk a little bit about my dad, to give you a little thought about how long my life has been. I sat on my dad's knee like most kids. My dad was born December 10th, 1876. America was 100 years old. He was born in Philadelphia, December 10th. Philadelphia, the cradle of democracy, Independence Hall and all that. And my dad was born the year of the Battle of the Little Bighorn. General Custer, who was the lieutenant colonel in the early wars, went to general, came back to lieutenant colonel when he fought his battle. Also of significance was this fellow Alexander Graham Bell was working with some tin cans and strings and doing different things to come up with a telephone. Everybody in this audience, I'm sure, has some kind of instrument that came out as a result of that time. There was also another fellow named Edison in New Jersey who was working on a light bulb. And there were hundreds, maybe thousands of other things that came out that year and the following years of my dad's life. But very interesting. I'm sitting here talking to you, and my dad saw those things come into fruition. I think the next thing that strikes my brain is 1931. I was 6 years old, and Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, who just 12 years before was the big American ace in World War I, and incidentally never flew an American plane. He flew only French and British. We had no American planes in Europe. But that event was Captain Eddie Rickenbacker was starting Eastern Airlines, and the ribbon cutting was going to take place at the Atlantic City Airport. And my dad took my brother and I, we went to Bader Field, Atlantic City, and Captain Eddie Rickenbacker sent one of his airplanes out to pick up a couple of his friends and brought them in for the ribbon cutting. And I went up and met Amelia Earhart, Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, and Charles Lindbergh, all in a 5-minute swoop of time. I was so excited. Of course, it was in concrete. I was going to be an aviator too. And my dad told me later in life that right after I met those three great aviators, a gentleman named Clarence Chamberlain came over and was kneeling down by me and talking to me and asked me what I wanted to do when I grew up. And he said, one thing I want you to remember, son, whatever you do your very best and stick with it and make sure that you come out number one. Because I was number 2 behind Charles Lindbergh. Had I tried just a little bit harder, you'd been greeting me up in the front and people would know who I was, Clarence Chamberlain. But since I was number 2, there's nobody here now than those Clarence Chamberlain. So as you go through life, put that little extra effort in there and always try to be number one. Next, Jimmy Stewart. Jimmy Stewart, you all remember him. He made a movie, It's a Wonderful Life, and I bet you watched it Christmas time. And everybody does. Jimmy Stewart in 1940-41 was a big star, just made that fantastic movie. And he was the first Hollywood star to join and avoid the draft out of Hollywood. First big name star. And he went in as a private in the Army Air Corps. They found out that he not only had a private license, but a commercial license. So Jimmy Stewart entered as a private. Soon as the military found out that he was an aviator, they gave him a modified military pilot training and made him a lieutenant. Of course, 3.5 years later, he was a bird colonel. But they started using him to make some training films and some advertisements on enlisting. I worked in a movie theater, 2 movies a night as an assistant projectionist. And this one night, I saw Lieutenant Jimmy Stewart come up on the screen, taxiing an airplane in, parked it, got out of the airplane, put his hat on, walked over through a gate up to a convertible with 2 gorgeous blue-eyed blondes standing there. Got a big hug. I said, boy, that's for me. And he turned around and he said, the government is dropping the 4-year college requirement to go to pilot training. As of now, regardless of what formal training you've had in education, you can take the test. And if you pass the test, you can become an aviation cadet and not get drafted into the Marines, the infantry or something. So being 17 years old, and it's at 17 to 23, peak of intelligence, 17. I played hooky from school the next day and went 60 miles to Philadelphia, my dad's birthplace. Took the academic tests, and to the amazement of everybody, I did very well. They said, we'll call you back for your physical. I went home. A couple of weeks later, I was called back. I went up, took my physical, went through that with a few minor difficulties. After the second, all my medical and everything, they said, you're qualified. We're going to swear you into the Enlisted Reserve Corps as an aviation cadet to be, and they can't touch you with the draft board. So I went home, and a matter of weeks, I got a letter that said, report to Camden, New Jersey to get sworn into the Enlisted Reserve Corps. So I did that, which meant I could not be drafted. They gave me a serial number or a card. And since I was a junior in high school, they said, you'll probably finish out your junior year at about a month and a half, 2 months ago. And then they'll call you to active duty. I went across the street, had my picture made in a leather jacket, white scarf, helmet, goggles. I had really arrived. I was going to be a pilot. I then went home, back to school. 10 days later, I went home for lunch. I lived about a block and a half from the school. Never go home for lunch, but for some reason, I did. I was about a half a block from my house, quiet winter day. Heard my mother cry, and I started running, got to the house. My sister said, you better go upstairs, talk to Mom. I went in, my mother was crying, holding a letter. She handed it to me and said I was to report to active duty to go to war in 2 days. I talked to her for about 20, 30 minutes and told her, I'm going to be sleeping in a nice warm bed, get up, have breakfast, go bomb or shoot somebody down, then come back home to a nice dinner, back into my bed. All my classmates that have been drafted or are going to be drafted, they're going to be in the foxholes, the trenches, eating sea rations, if anything, and I was going to be living pretty much a normal life. I convinced my mother that was what it was going to be. She settled down. I took the letter, ran back to school, went into my homeroom, which hadn't dispersed to the different classes yet. I looked through the little window, knocked, called my teacher over. Said, come here. He didn't like that at all. He came to the door and said, why are you late? What do you want? I said, read the letter. He read the letter. He said, okay, you need to take that to the principal, tell him what's going on. And I said, fine, but I got to talk to Claire Duff first. He said, why do you have to call Claire Duff out of here? I said, well, Friday night's the prom and she's my date and I'll be on a troop train headed somewhere. He looked at me and shook his head and said, yeah, you better talk to Claire Duff. So he got Claire out. I explained to her, and I was standing in water up to my ankle bones from her crying. What am I going to do? All the boys are gone, or spoken for. I finally got her to the point that I could leave and go see the principal. And the amazing thing is, last time I saw her was about 76 years, and she still didn't talk to me. So much for Claire Duff. I got called active duty. It was in pilot training, and I had soloed. I was getting ready to do my first cross country, Corsicana, Texas, Waxahachie, Texas, and Hillsborough, Texas. Low wing, open cockpit trainer. It had been raining. It was nasty. It was cold. So before I got in the old airplane to go, I drank my last cup of hot coffee. But I had some more. Got in the old airplane, started flying it along, doing well, but all of a sudden, as a teenager, you don't think about these things. I had to go wee-wee. And these trainer planes had no bathrooms in the open cockpit or anything. I knew I couldn't make it to my first checkpoint. I kept struggling. So I finally unhooked my seatbelt, opened up my fly, started to try and stand up and do it over the side. As soon as I started to stand up, this intelligence came into being. When you stand up, the airplane starts to fall away from me. The wind blast gets me, it starts to suck me out of the cockpit. I grab for the windscreen, hooked my foot under the instrument panel and hung on. Finally worked my way back into the cockpit. Sat there figuring out what can I do. I hooked my seatbelt and did what they teach you to do early on. If you fail with the machine operating, you look over one wing, then look over the other wing. Find a field where you can try and set it down rather than parachute. I saw a nice farmer's field. So I headed for that, went down. Fortunately, the ground was fairly firm. I landed, had to leave the engine running because those airplanes, you had to have somebody on the wing that would crank the engine. So I had nobody for that. So I let the engine idle. I unhooked, stood up, started to wee-wee, and believe it or not, that wind blast coming back put that stuff all over everything but the ground. I finished, got back in the airplane, buttoned things up, put the seatbelt on, and went on my merry way. One of the big lessons I learned about what you eat or drink before you go out flying and you don't have a bathroom. So that was a big thing. I went on through pilot training, graduated, became a B-17 four-engine bomber pilot. All three officers were 19. None of us had finished the 11th or 12th grade. And we were at the peak of our life, flying a big bomber. I had never driven a car in my life. It wasn't automatic in those days, stick shift. So here I am, flying a B-17. The war ended in Europe. I moved into the new super secret B-29 Super Fortress to carry the bombs that stopped the war. At age 20, I was the B-29 pilot. The war ended. I hadn't finished the 11th grade. I was 20 years old. I had no trade. Every guy that was drafted was coming back to his old job or any new jobs that were created. I couldn't get a job. I couldn't go back to 11th grade. I couldn't go to college. I hadn't finished 11th grade. I was sitting one day, and along came a recruiter, got talking to me. He said, well, you can go back in the service as a master sergeant. I said, they're not going to make me a master sergeant, age 20. He says, the rules say you can go back, maybe a pilot. They're taking some enlisted pilots. Take a GED. I said, what's a GED? He explained. He says, take the GED, get your high school diploma. There's all kinds of college courses being offered on the basis. You get yourself a couple years of college. You can try for a commission, and they'll grab your right up because you can fly B-29s. He says, then you'll be back being a pilot and all. So I enlisted, took my GED in Tokyo while I was over there. I learned to be an air traffic controller because they wouldn't let me fly anymore as a pilot. 6.5 years as an air traffic controller. And the Korean War starts up. One night, Friday night during the Korean War, every B-29 that was flying over North Korea was shot down. And I knew John J. Riley, congressman from Sumter, and I met him at the Elks Club. He said, we need B-29 pilots, and you're sitting here as an air traffic controller. He says, come with me Monday to Washington. I said, can't do it. Long story short, he immediately got me recalled as a lieutenant, being an instructor in single-engine jet fighters. I flew nothing but four-engine bombers. So started my new career back as a pilot of bombers, that time flying B-25s, T-33, and the P-80. I went through the Korean War, commander of the unit, flew fighters, forward air controller, did a year in the Belgian Congo in civilian clothes, C-130. I flew 387 combat missions in Vietnam. Was manager of all the air traffic controllers in Southeast Asia. And got to the end of the war, retired, and tried to figure out what to do because I was extremely qualified in air traffic control all over the world. I thought back to moments where I was assigned to NATO headquarters in Brussels, and I represented the United States in a 14-nation committee called SEAC. Gave me a very broad knowledge of the world. I'd spent 5 years in the Pacific Rim, 10.5 years in Europe. And also it took me back that I was selected because of my knowledge of air traffic control to go to Le Bourget Airport, the Paris Air Show, 1959, 1961. And one of the interesting things there was one day I was walking through the lobby Le Bourget, and a Pan Am flight attendant, or stewardess, so they call that, said, "Captain Gannon, I want you to meet somebody." She took me inside in the VIP lounge. Saw a gentleman that looked familiar, but didn't quite know him. Stuck his hand out and said, "What do you do, Captain?" I said, "I work with the French air traffic controllers during the air show. Americans get in trouble, I can help them. French had nothing but VHF communications. I brought my own UHF communications, TACAN, etc." And I kept looking at this gentleman. He said, "Benny Floyd, Benjamin Floyd." He says, "I was the first military aviator in the world, really." And I smiled and I said, "Beg to differ. You know, I'm getting close to 20 years as a pilot at this point." And I said, "That was Lieutenant Selfridge." He says, "Yes, the Signal Corps bought 2 Wright flyers. They were going to replace the hot air balloons. And one of the Wright brothers were going to teach us how to fly these 2 air machines that the government bought. And Lieutenant Selfridge went up first, and one of the Wright brothers took him up, was teaching him to fly. And they crashed, and Lieutenant Selfridge got killed, never made a landing. And the Wright brothers survived. His brother was supposed to take me up in a couple of days and teach me how to fly. But I waited week, second week, and finally I said, "The hell with it. I can fly this thing, you know. You pull back on that stick and it makes you go up. You push forward, you go down. When you go left, you press with the left foot, move the stick left." So I went out, told the old crew chief, "I'm taking her up." So I went up, flew around, piece of cake, brought it back and landed. Now there's the difference. Selfridge went up, he never landed. I'm the first military aviator because I took off, I flew around, and I came back and landed, and I can talk about it. So there's still some confusion about that, but you can rest assured I'm the first one. The last thing wrapping up my story, 1980, I decided to retire. I went out the door and I found that I was in big demand. I'd worked at all the daddy rabbits in the Pacific Rim throughout Europe. I had flown every type of airplane. So consulting jobs were there for my asking, and I enjoyed it very much. I was also asked to be a commissioner for the Florence City County Airport Commission. And I took that job. I thought that helped me get into the community. And as a result of taking that job, I was offered the job running the airport. I wasn't an airport director, but I could spell airplane and spell airport, and the people thought that was sufficient. So I became the executive director of the Florence City County Airport, changed the name to regional, went from 1 airline, 6 employees, to 4 airlines and 38 employees. And that completed my dreams of everything I ever wanted to do when I was a kid. And I stood there one day thinking, and just the other day, for the first time, I was able to see the full movie, Saving Private Ryan. And I remember right near the end, there was something said that I tried to live my life, and that I should have lived it sufficient that I have made a difference in life. That's what I hope. I've made a difference.